All right, so this is our final speaker of the semester, and somebody I've had the pleasure of working with in a variety of different capacities, from friendship and collaboration around growing startups to formal partnership, and I think is going to really help to bring a lot of the different themes and strands that we've covered over this semester together. So with that, the co-founder and CEO of General Assembly, Jake Schwartz. All right, so we decided to just do this as a fireside chat.
Yes.
So let's just start with the basics of how did you end up building a company that is revolutionizing workforce development and technical education?
Well, really by accident in some ways and by complete intention in others. So when we started General Assembly, it was originally called Superconductor. And it was going to be just a small co-working project in New York City, which we felt like was emerging as a startup hub, and we thought it'd be really cool to have a place that was sort of for founders, by founders. And
this is what, 5 years ago?
This is 2010.
Okay, so 5 years ago.
We eventually changed the name to General Assembly. And sort of when we were trying to think about what our brand should be, we sort of were coming across all these different values that we found that we cared about. And one of them was that we thought the principle of this place should be all about learning by doing. That one of the best ways to learn was to do, which is what all these startup founders were sort of engaged in, and that we wanted to create a place of learning that was really all about doing. And it's funny because that little thing, in some ways, that little like kernel of an idea that was more metaphorical than anything, led us to sort of create a room inside our space that we decided to call a classroom. And then out of that room, we decided, hey, wouldn't it be funny if we ran some classes? And after a couple of months, we were filling that classroom up literally morning, noon, and night. That we realized that, whoa, there's something going on here, right? But now there's a couple of other things, right? So we were all my co-founders and I were pretty committed serial entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. None of us had breakout successes of any type, but we had all started things and we're pretty sure we were going to start something big someday. The funny thing is for all of us, General Assembly none of us thought that was going to be the thing that was going to be the breakout hit.
This was the thing that you were doing in preparation. This was the thing
to start the thing. Yeah, it was going to be, we were basically doing this elaborate project so that we would have our own free office space.
Right.
In a lot of ways, that's I think how we thought about it when we started. But what happened was as soon as we saw the momentum, first we sold out that space very quickly, so we didn't know what to do with our time that we had budgeted for this. We decided to start running classes. Those classes started selling out. And it was at that point that there became sort of a moment of intention. Mm-hmm. And for me, it came from a lot of my own personal experiences in my 20s. So, I had graduated from Yale, thought, the world was going to be my oyster coming out of an Ivy League school, because I'd grown up in Oregon where nobody went to Ivy League school, so I figured I had made it, And got out into the world and realized I knew nothing and nobody wanted to hire me to do anything.
You are talking to a bunch of students about to graduate from elite universities.
Sorry. So. Come to GA. No. So in a lot of ways, so I felt that pain in my 20s of sort of wandering around, wondering where I should go, what should I do, and I eventually went back to business school. We should have some MBAs in the room, right? Yeah, a lot of MBAs. So, and when I was at Wharton for business school, I kept looking at it being like, wow, this is it's a couple of years, it's a lot of money. But what's funny, what I noticed is after the first 12 weeks were super intense, and we were learning statistics and finance and accounting and game theory, and it was pretty deep and kind of mind-opening. But after those first 12 weeks, it's everybody's brains just switched immediately to getting a job and partying as hard as you could while you still could before,
It's your last gasp before you
right,
really have to enter
it's sort of like college redux where you get to do all the things you wish you had done in college.
So now it's more wine instead of beer?
Now? Oh, I don't...
At MBA?
No, at MBA I think it's more beer.
It's still,
yeah. It's all the people who wish they had been in frats in college.
Got
to then experience that in business school. And so, and I kept thinking about that being like, and when I got out of Wharton, I like found that in my job, the most useful, thing I had taken from that experience was the 2-day training the street workshop that I had paid for myself to learn how to build a financial model. And so, I started putting all these things together, and then we were working on all these startups. They were all constantly complaining about not being able to find enough developers. And we saw these classes selling out, and sort of you just put together this constellation of things. Clearly there was a resonance around taking classes as an adult because people were coming in droves to do that. Clearly there was, from my own experience, a mismatch, an inefficient sort of market-making mechanism happening in the world of sort of wanting to move forward in your career and what are your options to do so. And then clearly there was this huge need for a certain skill set that wasn't out there in the market. And all those things kind of swam together. And then probably the key thing was I just happened to go visit this school. It's this random school in Illinois called Tribeca Flashpoint. And they had just started up. And it was one of these sort of media colleges for, basically kids who aren't that good at high school, but they like making video games and stuff. And so it's like a 4-year degree. But they have a huge career services department. They help people get jobs. And when I was sitting in the lobby, I was just sort of looking around, and all their advertisements were speaking directly to the parent. And they were all about, hey, your kid's going to like this school, but oh, by the way, they're going to get a job at the end.
Great.
And something in that my brain sort of clicked from that sort of where I realized that everybody in the Valley, and when people talk about disrupting education, they think of education as a media business. And if you go down the path of it being like a media business, you think of it in terms of, okay, so at one time there were theaters, Broadway was a big thing, and then there was the movies, and now there's internet, and it's sort of these waves of disruption that sort of centralize the distribution power and allow for the single star to sort of spread and broadcast throughout the land. But the reality is
the sort of Sal Khan thesis. If you could just
yeah,
create somebody who's really teaching
or
stuff
Sebastian
content.
Thrun or
Yeah.
Daphne or any of these people is this idea that media is the paradigm to which you should look through the disruption of education, and that's what's going on. And when I looked at it, I said, the secret though is that nobody pays that much money for education content. Yes, textbooks can be a couple $100, but if you look at why people are excited about education is if you look at the global spend on education, it's trillions of dollars, gets people really excited. Right. Most of that money is not going to the content. It's going to the surfaces around that content. That's what's so expensive. And when I started to put the pieces together, what I realized is education isn't a media business, right? It partly, there is a media business inside education, but education is much more of an investment business where students invest their time, their energy, their money with you, and they expect a return over a short period of time after they graduate, but also long term. So if you take it back to MBA, you're putting, God knows, $200,000 on debt or just writing checks to this institution. And why are you doing that? You're not doing that so that you can get your next job out of school, but you kind of are, right? It's probably worth it. You're doing it because that job will lead to the next job, will lead to that next job. And then there's also this vague promise of over the next 20 to 30 years, the network of being part of Georgetown, of having that credential, that signal that you got an MBA, all those things, will create more earnings that will have a net present value greater than the $200,000 you spent on this experience. And so that by applying that paradigm to sort of this idea of what's going to happen in education and where all these needs, what I realized was we need to invest in our brand, which we fortunately already had. We need to be only building programs that got people real jobs that could tangibly describe the return on investment that they were providing immediately. And really build the brand all around that.
To work backwards from what are the skill sets that are in super high demand?
Correct.
With a clearly defined set of attributes attached to them.
So you start with the goal, and then you build the whole curriculum from that point. You build the whole program from that point. You design the entire model from that point. And then what you have is something where you can go to people, just like Fidelity or Vanguard says, hey, invest with us and we won't lose your money. We say, invest with us and you will get a job and you will be a step further on your career. And it turns out that works pretty well. So in a lot of ways, that was how we did it. And so I wish I could tell you this like incredibly sexy story of how we saw this opportunity in education, or it's been my lifelong passion to do it. And education was just is so in disarray, and our mission is to fix it. And those things are true at some level, but the reality is what we saw was this opportunity. We saw sort of a way to sort of thread the needle and provide an alternative, you know, in this really highly regulated, highly constructed, just space loaded with stuff in it. And we just kind of did it. And then we waited for somebody to tell us we weren't allowed to do it, and that never happened.
So it's interesting, right? Because I find in the work we do with startups, like we see tons and tons and tons of edtech startups. And you almost always see the same phenomenon, which is almost everyone has at least gone to high school. Most people have gone to college that we deal with. And so they assume that they know about education, when in fact the education industry is unbelievably complex.
So I call this the restaurant phenomenon, which is that everybody, because by nature of going and eating at restaurants, thinks they know what it would take to start a restaurant or run a restaurant. And it's the same thing in education. Like it's something you've had an experience with, you've touched, you've felt, so you think you understand it. And you think you have the perfect idea of how to solve it. I mean, I meet this, sometimes I'll go to like talk, you know, I'll give a talk or something, and I'll get approached by strangers who aren't entrepreneurs, they haven't thought about this, but they have all these ideas about education because, you know, everybody...
Here's what I hated about high school.
Exactly.
You go, well, that's useful,
but what's also interesting is that edtech is a huge attractor of people who want to do good in the world. It seems like an industry that has money in it, right? And there are some somewhat financially successful businesses in it, but it feeds everybody's soul around, I'm doing good for the world, I am, you know, creating value, I'm helping the next generation, all those kind of things. The problem is that what that does is that inspires a lot of more entrepreneurs than probably the ecosystem can hold. It inspires a lot more investment dollars than the ecosystem can hold. And people seem to forget that, like, I mean, literally the largest education business in the world is like $20 billion, which is not a small amount of money, but there's only one of them.
Right.
And there are lots of other industries where there's like 5 or 6 $50 billion companies. And so it's something that people sort of forget about education, is that it's a huge spend, but it's massively fragmented along different types of, like it's like fragmented based on, like, you know, age group, it's fragmented based on region, it's fragmented based on socioeconomic status, and it's very, very hard to consolidate it in meaningful ways.
And you in fact have rules at multiple different levels of government that reinforce that fragmentation.
Absolutely, and I think this is one of the things that the regulation right now is so fascinating about, is that they sort of are both, they are trying to solve with regulation the same problems that they created with the same regulations. And that's, it's sort of it's a catch-22 of government in that way. And they all mean well, but they don't quite understand how the things they did 20 years ago have created where we are today, and how they might want to go a different path.
But you go out now and you talk all about sort of the future of higher education, future of workforce development, education policy, all this kind of stuff. When did you realize when did you start studying this industry in depth, in earnest?
So it was, I mean, besides my own sort of prosumer, you know, going around and consuming stuff.
Aside from buying several degrees, investing in several degrees.
Is really, it was about a month and a half into our little experiment running classes.
So you started a class, it took off so fast, you went, there's something to
this,
this,
something
I need
here.
to study up.
Right, but the problem is that business was never going to be a big business. It was very obvious. It was like a bad off-Broadway theater, right? We had 30 seats. Maybe we could do 2 shows a night, right? $20 a ticket, you know, and you have to fill it up with a different show every night. Like, there was no way that was ever going to work as a business. It was super cool and it was exciting. We were bringing lots of people in, but I knew it had to transform from there. But what I saw in that little nugget was people were coming. They were buying tickets. They were opting to do this instead of watching, you know, TV or whatever. I mean, lots of more fun things to do than go to a class, except for that. For people, once you're out in the world, and maybe MBA students, when you were out, you realize how much you miss that experience from college, that experience of learning from people who might know something you want to take from, learning from peers and connecting with people who want to learn the same things you do. And that there was a real power there. And we just needed to find a better way to deliver that like was more economically and sort of just value proposition wise was like a sustainable model.
So a key step, I mean, I remember when we first started working together, it felt like from a brand standpoint, you were first and foremost known as sort of the hub, centrally organizing kind of the New York startup scene, and you guys had this education thing. And you guys made a pretty profound announcement a couple months after we started working together where you said, by the way, we're shutting down all that stuff we're doing that's organizing the New York startup scene, the hub, all that kind of stuff. We're just an education company.
So what's funny about that is in our heads that had happened like 2 years earlier, but we just kept it running because we liked it. We thought it was fun, and we didn't want to kill that thing because it was sort of where we came from. It felt like, burning down the house you grew up in or something. We loved it. And it was only when we needed the real estate back desperately and real estate prices had doubled, no small part due to probably us being there.
Right.
That we needed to go back and take that lease. And by the way, at that point, there were tons of co-working options available. We weren't really offering anything except for probably cheaper space at that stage. So it wasn't really like a good setup. But it's so interesting because even today, 5 years in, right? We've been an education company since March of 2011 in our heads, right? Even today, some people still think that we're a co-working space. And there's what's funny is that how deep those first impressions run and what kind of staying power they have. But I also think there's another lesson out of that, which is that by naming ourselves General Assembly, not like place to work or come startup hangout zone or whatever, we were able to kind of go to where the world was telling us we needed to go.
You got a brand that was inspiring but not specific.
Correct. And by the way, the values that we sort of imbibed it with when we started it still carry on to this day. We have the same brand as when we were just a co-working space. It works fine because it was done very authentically. This is something nobody talks about at business school, but like the power of brand and creating flexibility with your brand to do different things is so important. And so if we had called ourselves Startup Hangout Zone, no matter how hard we tried to run classes and be like, oh, we're education, it would have never stuck at all, right? But because we were called General Assembly, we could sort of move in that direction in a very gentle way, and it felt very organic. So yeah, I mean, I see this all the time with companies that when they name themselves something, exactly what they do right then, it's very tempting because you're like, I got to stand up in the noise. People got to know what we do. I want my URL to be descriptive. The problem is it doesn't create any kind of aspiration of in your consumer's head, you want them to imagine what you are, right? And to have a character around it. And if you just call yourself what you do, it doesn't leave much to the imagination or to that sort of spiritual side of things. But also, it constrains you, massively.
We talk a lot with our startups about the fact that your brand should be about the why of your business, the aspiration, the motivation, the thing that inspires, not how or what you do. And to your point,
it's I mean, it was back in Web 1.0 where you could do buybarbecues.com or something, and that would be a perfectly fine URL. In fact, you were lucky if you had that URL because it would show up on search results and things, but we're sort of very far past that world.
So let's continue on. So at the point at which you guys decided your education company was just about the point at which coding boot camps were becoming hot.
No. We were way before that. So this is the thing. So when we started, there was no such thing. We didn't even know if we were allowed to do it. There was no model. So we just started okay, we got to build our first long-form course, then we'll build our second long-form course. There was one example, which was there's this thing called the Hungry Academy, which was Living Social here in DC, ran their own sort of classroom program to train up developers.
Because they literally couldn't find enough
developers. They couldn't find enough people,
DC.
And they were just going to pump them through, right? They were growing super fast. They had raised stupid amount of money. And so that was sort of the inspiration in a lot of ways. So we started doing that. And this is sort of the next thing, is that you don't realize how fast you will be copied. So literally before, we were sort of starting to watch and people started to sort of inch towards that same thing. And then before we knew it, maybe a year later, it was there was one in every single city, right? Now, what we knew is that our strategy was much beyond this idea of coding bootcamp, and that just doing a coding bootcamp is not a very sustainable business. but it was crazy how fast it happened. And it was really in some ways because we had given permission to people that you could do this and not get like shut down by the government in one day.
But let's talk to that. So we had in a previous session we had Ben Wallerstein in.
Yes.
He was using this sort of GA case study as sort of one of his examples of how do you engage with regulators, and he used you as the example of sort of proactively trying to figure out how to engage with regulators.
Right, but I mean, that's now we're like, look, we've raised like $120 million, we have 600 employees, like we're the big guy, and we want to work with them.
If somebody's going to you guys have got to be engaged.
Correct, right, and we had proactive, and it hurts us more than it hurts anybody else. So that, like, yes, we are incredibly proactive now, and it's really positive, and we have the resources to put towards lobbyists and in-house regulation people, and we do a lot to sort of give back in interesting ways and create relationships so that if the shit ever does hit the fan, which fortunately has not, you have someone to call, which is about as much as you can hope for. But in the beginning, we didn't even know. I mean, like for the
you didn't realize you were in a regulated space.
We weren't acting as if. I mean, and it was funny because I think we got our first whiff of it, like a year in. We talked to some lawyer just like offhand who happened to be around, and then she was like, you know that you're like under this jurisdiction in New York State and you're totally operating in like flagrant violation of these rules, right? And we were like, huh? And then we like Googled it and we were like, oh, wow, that's no good. They were like, well, maybe we should register. But then we were like, but if we register, maybe
then they'll
that'll
know.
Bring attention to them. And so we kind of made this like very conscious decision to wait for a cease and desist, which came in like the end of 2012, at which point we hired our first like lawyer. We hired a lobbyist in Albany. We started working with them. And we found very quickly that they didn't want to shut us down. They just, it's more of like a kiss the ring kind of thing combined with like basic consumer protection.
Right.
And this is the other thing that I think in the age of Uber, what people fail to realize is there's a huge difference between regulation and sort of entrenched monopolistic interests trying to protect what's theirs, right? The monopoly of the taxi limousine commission in each city was pretty significant, right? And they made a lot of money for a long time, and they were very cozy with politicians. So it looked like regulation on the surface. But what was fueling it underneath it was people really actively trying to protect their own economic interests very aggressively.
In New York, literally, these medallions traded for like $1 million.
Oh, yeah. And then
like,
all of a sudden, it's like, I mean,
asset.
people have lost a lot of money on that. So you can understand, if you owned 60 taxi medallions, or there was a guy who owned like 300 of them, right?
$300 million asset.
And by the way, he didn't own them all with cash. He was like probably levered 80-20 on them.
Right.
So all of a sudden you see this threat to the value of that medallion. You're going to do everything in your power to try to fight that. And that's really what happened. In our industry, that's not what's going on. There's no entrenched interest trying to, at least not yet, who's trying to fight against us. What it is that the government, through many, many cycles, have figured out that like, hey, people, can do a lot of shady stuff if they like pop up a sign saying they're running a school and they can take advantage of immigrants or poor people or whatever.
To your point, it's an investment business.
Correct. Right.
You have the same shyster behavior
exactly.
in any investment
business. What's funny is like in New York, we're regulated by the same sort of institution, the regulatory institution that also regulates beauty schools, right? Because literally, every neighborhood in Queens has some basement beauty school that's probably operating under the radar that's taking somebody's life savings in cash, promising them a job as a beautician, and then absconding with the money to, St. Lucia or whatever. So like that's like the space we're in. And so we're clearly not going to do that. And so we just sort of show up and we say, hey, here's our intention. Here's what we're doing. We have a pretty good understanding of the dynamics and what they care about, what we care about, they've seen a lot of bad actors in their day, and they can sort of tell that that's not what we're trying to do. But you do have to sort of respect it, is something I've sort of seen. And it can be sometimes hard to respect it because you have these career bureaucrats who are completely intellectually dead inside and emotionally dead inside.
You can quote him on that, by the way. That's a
who have spent the last 40 years doing something one way. These are the good ones, by the way, because the good ones care, right? And you can, it's very tempting to sort of have this element of like, oh, I don't need you, I'm just gonna go past you, or like, you know, but what I've learned, and especially like in DC, like it's sort of that you can't fight City Hall. Like you cannot ignore or cajole or sort of bully government into doing what you want. And I mean, I'm not saying like we ever really tried, but I think in my head I was sort of like, I for a long time I treated local and even federal government as sort of this annoying thing. They were going to go so slow that I was just going to speed past them. I mean, this was like a couple of years ago. I kind of realized that I was just like hitting my head against a wall, and that you have to sort of, you can't really even convince them of your point of view. What you have to do is watch and read the tea leaves and sort of surf it like a big tsunami wave. And the minute I sort of adopted that approach of like, you know, government is something that cannot be really, it can be slightly influenced, but you really have to have the attitude of, I'm a surfer, the government has created this wave, I will now go on it the best to my ability. And what's amazing is that attitude has gotten us a lot more invitations to sit at the table, a lot more invitations to give feedback and insights and thoughts on the matter, and actually given us more influence. So anyway, that's.
Oh, I remember even when we were launching in DC.
Oh yeah, we had to go to this. I remember that we had to go to the city council, right?
And it was a fascinating because on the one hand, when we launched 1776, we were required as part of our partnership with the mayor's office to work with someone you guys to bring a program in. But then when we actually got in front of the education part of government, and it was like this, like all the different sides. So you had the economic development people going, this is an absolute must, DC needs this. And then you had the education people going, well, slow down, we need to follow a process, and you're, you know, again, you've just got bureaucrats fighting with bureaucrats.
But you also have to, like this, you have to respect it. Like, it's not all completely nonsensical, right? Like, and as much as like a techno-libertarian as I'd like to believe I am, like at the end of the day, like you don't want the world to be a Wild West. And like the fact of the matter is, you know, we all like to believe that whatever thing we're starting, like we've invented this from whole cloth. The reality is what General Assembly is not like, it's not like a totally original idea. It's twisted in interesting ways and sort of adjusted, but at its core, we are a vocational school.
I remember growing up, like, I'll reveal how old I was, but like you watched like television, there'd be ads for like the ITT Technical Institute,
so,
like
and
come here, do your degree.
So here's like the truth. I remember like when I was a kid, like growing up and like you have your sick day and you're like staying at home, right? And you're like watching like daytime soaps or whatever, and you're like, this is boring, but then these ads are super weird and you've never seen them before. And I remember all these ITT ads and DeVry ads, and then I remember the
Diesel Institute.
And then I remember being, you know, out of college and, you know, as this Yale grad, not being able to find a job and seeing these ads and being like, that's bullshit, why can't I go do that? But of course, like, after coming from Yale, like, you can't go to ITT Tech, like, that's considered like, you know, it's like a class transgression.
It would be a bold move.
Right. And that's ridiculous, right? That's sort of my point. And so what we're trying to do in a lot of ways is create a place, a safe space to learn skills, have community. What? Oh, yeah. In our safe space. So basically, like we try to do that in a way that like is palatable and socially acceptable. Like if you went to Princeton, you're still allowed to go and do this because you might actually need some skills in your career.
When you go to see the GA courses in DC, it's amazing how many of the people in them are Georgetown grads and GW grads and American grads. And part of it is that it's people that already have that elite pedigree that are taking the courses.
Well, because the idea is, and so if anything, I don't think of us as really disrupting, you know, college at all, right? If anything, I think over time, what we want to do is create an alternative to graduate school. And not even like an alternative, like a substitute, as a thing to do in your mid-20s when you have no idea what to do, and all of a sudden you start to think about taking the LSAT. like that's the moment where I hope you will come to GA, right? That's the idea. And like we have people who take our data science program and then will go on to get their master's in data science. That's great. I have nothing against that. I'm not trying to like, you know, keep that. But what I'm trying to keep is this idea that, okay, you like don't know where you're going. You know, you just like got kicked out of your apartment because your roommate got a girlfriend. and you're like, what am I gonna do? I don't even like my job. Should I even live in this city?
My parents are gonna cut me off
Yeah,
soon.
my parents keep asking me, like, I have to go home for Thanksgiving again. What are the questions I'm gonna get? Like that's the moment that for me, like that's that lost and lonely feeling. And like for me, growing up in Oregon, like my parents didn't know. They couldn't give me any good advice. I didn't grow up in the East Coast. My dad's friend couldn't just get me an internship or a job or something like that. And so
We have a lot of laughs around.
yeah, you all got jobs from your dad's friend. Is that what it is? No.
Somebody who has.
Yeah. And so that was sort of the core thing, and like the core problem I was trying to solve, at least in my head when we were doing this.
So let's the good news for the higher education system is you're not planning to take out undergrad. Bad news is you are going after grad school.
Right, which does happen to be the cash cow of all these university systems.
So talk about that. So the most obvious question is, you are fulfilling a market gap that in a totally efficient market, one assumes universities would have found a way to fulfill, right? And one of the interesting things, we had a university professor come through and do a tour at 1776. We took him down and took him through all the GA stuff. He's like, this is fascinating. And he literally met somebody who was a recent graduate from his university. And he sort of went through the whole thing. He's like, well, we should find a way to partner with General Assembly. And the part that was fascinating to me was, well, why is a recent graduate from your university feeling the need to immediately go into...
And this is the part where I'm saying, like, I'm not trying to disrupt them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm just trying to add something. And frankly, if you look at our economics and our margins and the way we're set up, it'd be very, very hard for a university to do it, because universities have spent now, let's call it 100 years building a certain type of infrastructure, right? And sometimes even more than that, having the base underneath that. And so they have, legions of tenured professors who are incredibly distinguished in incredibly specialized niches in their fields, whose primary mission, they've been told through their entire careers, is to publish and create new scholarly work that changes something somewhere, hopefully. And then maybe they have to teach a little bit on the side. And we'll give some prizes to the really passionate teachers, because we do have all these students around. But that's essentially the model of the university, and it's worked incredibly well. And if you think about the role of the university in the society over the last 500 years, it's really as a bastion of these really smart people to think and share notes and have access to libraries and to sort of have it was almost like a prototypical version of the internet, right? Where you had to keep everybody really close together in different disciplines, and they would talk and have dinner. And
well, UNTL, I did my undergrad at Oxford, and it's hysterical there because it literally had its origins as a bunch of monasteries.
Right.
Where monks would come together, and the teaching part only became a thing down the road. Originally, it was just...
as a way, in some ways, to either create the next generation or to monetize, right? One or the other.
The monks had to monetize their monasteries, basically.
And so, those are incredibly important institutions, and we need our research institutions incredibly badly, right? We need to be investing in basic sciences. We need to be investing in engineering and technologies. They need to be partnering and doing technology transfer and all that sort of stuff. But, over the last, call it 60, 70 years since the GI Bill, what has happened is there's been basically this amazing gold rush around the idea of if you create a higher education program, your students basically have unlimited access to federal funding. Because the economy was growing, it looked like all of your graduates just kept doing better and better every year. You could raise your prices by 5% every year, which no other industry, including healthcare, can do. And everything just seemed to work, right? And so you've built these incredible margin machines, right? The problem is that, when it turns, and we all sort of seen this, you've probably done case studies around really high margin businesses when things start to get squeezed. The minute students started to wake up, which I think started to be after the financial crisis, and they said, is this really worth it, right? I have a lot of friends who are struggling to pay off their student debt. Maybe I should actually think before I sign these papers. cultural shift. And what I didn't understand at the time when we started this was like, this was right after the financial crisis. We could sort of feel it, but very vaguely. What I didn't appreciate is how fast that idea would go mainstream, right? I didn't know there was going to be New York Times articles about this, Wall Street Journal articles about it, and The Economist writing about this, and like everybody sort of it being okay to say, hey, maybe this whole system isn't really worth it.
Do you know Jeff Slingo, right?
I know him really well.
Yeah, and
I'm actually in his first book.
As am I. The College Unbound, right? So his
Small world.
His whole thesis, right, is that higher education has become an inefficient bundle.
Right. Now the problem is like, that's great, but making it more efficient isn't as easy said and done.
Right. You can't just unbundle it and rebundle it.
Right, because and I think here's the couple things that it'll be really interesting to see. First of all, you'll see a lot of these like sort of mediocre, middle to lower tier universities start to go bankrupt, and you're already starting to see a little bit of it. It's going to be a long. Okay, there you go.
Yes.
Long, slow process of some bankruptcies, some consolidations, which, by the way, has happened before. The whole, Harvard and Radcliffe, that all happened because they were not, they were having economic difficulties at the time. So that'll be one way to do it. But the real thing that will be fascinating to watch is when universities start challenging this idea of tenure and what it means. And it's like the third rail. You won't even see that much written about it. But the secret of it is like, even at a place like this, I'm sure the faculty has a committee that has incredible power, right? In fact, the faculty probably gets a vote on all important matters around the business school. Probably the faculty gets it around the university. And that's an incredibly huge hammer for the faculty to have, which means that anything that sort of goes against the idea of research first, teaching when you can fit it in, and sort of, job for life, and it goes against that is not really, something that people get excited about. The problem is that model doesn't work with what we're doing, right? And most professors would just be in horror at the idea of having to teach vocational skills. So we end up getting a lot of calls from top business schools and universities saying, hey, none of our professors want to teach this. Could you guys come in and, prep people on how to use SQL and Excel, or teach them how to code a little bit, or UX design, product management. All these things become opportunities, and it's that sense that it's complementary, because I don't ever want to be in the business of teaching people basic theory. I don't want to be, I'm not going to ever take on the humanities, right? Although there might be a business opportunity there for somebody.
There could be a GA course on basic writing. That would be immensely useful.
It's just not what we do, but I think that'd be pretty cool.
You get a lot of people graduating from universities who still can't write.
I know, it'd be interesting to see. But do you even need to write anymore? I mean, you could just write like WeChat smiley faces and you're pretty good, right?
You could just do... So, big policy shift. We talked about local stuff, but big policy shift at the federal level is Title IV. So now, Department of Education is saying that coding boot camps, like General Assembly, will now be able to theoretically get their students federal student loans at federal student loan rates. Do you want to? Is that something?
Well, okay. So first of all, it's a tiny little experiment, right? Which
a tiny experiment is part of a massive pool of money.
It's not even that. I mean, I don't know how much money it's going to be, but it's tiny in the scheme of things.
Yep.
The Department of Ed spent about a year sort of working up to this. They still ended up in the wrong place. And what I mean by the wrong place is nobody who they want to participate in this wants to participate in it.
Right.
Which is sort of like, okay, what are you doing?
They put so many constraints upon it that exactly what they're trying to do.
So then the requirement is that GA, or organizations like GA, have to partner with an institution, so like a Georgetown, which we've talked to Georgetown about it, and then find like a third-party sort of assurance quality auditor type thing, and then together the three of us can then do some cohorts that are funded by Pell money. But Pell money is only for undergraduates, and really only undergraduates of very low income, right? Universities, that money is precious for them. When they have a Pell student, they suck all of that Pell money up first, right? Because that's the money they can count on, the government pays for it. So the idea of asking universities to share any of their like precious revenue it doesn't make them happy. For us, we were very happy doing what we were doing, and like we have tons of different loan providers who love to offer low interest rate loans to our students, and like it's fine. And so it's not really clear like what problem they're actually solving. Now, the biggest problem, and this is just me like bitching about government now, is that
this is your techno-libertarian.
Yeah. Fortunately, this won't go on video, for another couple weeks. Right
another
now.
Couple weeks.
Maybe.
No.
No. I mean, like, look. Here's what I find. Everybody at the government cares and pretty much gets it and would like to make things better. So that's you have to start with that as number one. Is that they're not evil, they're not dumb. I haven't met a single dumb person at the federal government level that I've met so far. But what it
particularly at the level you're dealing with.
What it is constrained, right? And so they have very specific tools that they have to use to try to solve these other problems. They may not perfectly fit. But the biggest thing now is, as the administration winds down, there's this pressure to do stuff, right? Have things to talk about. Be able to claim victories. And so what happens is they rush these things at the door. If you look at the length of the program, there won't be anyone left who built this program when it's like all wrapped up to say, hey, was that a success or a failure? So it's basically an experiment where no one's going to be there to like see the results at the end. And so you as a business person sort of have to work in this context and say, okay, there's a risk reward, right? The risk is I don't do it, and then the government thinks I'm sort of being rude to them or something like that.
You've offended them.
Right, or I don't
did this for you.
I no longer get invited to the right meetings. But there's another risk is that I do it and it becomes a big brouhaha, or the Republicans decide to make a big deal out of it, or something. There's all these risks. And the upside is not financial at all, right? Because this is not.
You already have loan providers.
This is not going to drive my business, right? But what it could, if you go like 2 turns down the road, maybe there's a big opportunity, and I won't. If I'm not right there in the middle of it, I won't have seen it. And so these are all the sort of risk and reward things. And I think, if anything, I can tell people who are thinking about going into regulated industries is that looking at it, trying to look at these kind of regulatory environment issues and government relations issues through the lens of risk and reward, and understanding it, even though you can't fully quantify it the way you can do an income statement, you can try, is a very, very powerful way to sort of keep yourself focused on building your business and not getting sort of enticed by every little thing that comes along.
So, final sets of questions, and we want to open up for students. So, scaling. So, you guys, started in New York, but you're now in 15 cities around the world?
14 right now. We'll
14.
be 15 very soon.
And you experimented with a couple different models for sort of how to move into other cities and scale. But what have you learned about sort of that city base? How do you decide? We were talking about this before the class started, right? Like we were throwing out some cities you might want to consider. You're like, well, there's this issue, there's that issue. I mean, what have you guys learned? What are the signals that tell you when it's time to scale, and how do you do that well?
Well, those are sort of 2 different questions, right? So when we go into a market, in the beginning we were sort of like, we were chasing the shiny object, It's like the UK called us up and said, hey, you should come over there. We're like, okay.
They want us.
In hindsight, that was stupid, but like at the time, it seemed like a great idea. And it worked out okay, but it was a pain. We went to Berlin and actually pulled out, right? It was very similar. We had Deutsche Telekom and thrown all this money at us and made all the sense of the world. We went there and we realized that, okay, once that Deutsche Telekom money ran out, there was no actual market there. Everybody was poor. Salaries for starting web developers were like half of what they were in New York. And so the only way that we could have sort of survived there was to crunch everything down, reduce our prices in half, sort of reduce our margin in half, and then we would have to make it up in volume. Now this goes to your scaling thing. Making it up in volume is a terrible idea, right? Because scale comes with its own sort of frictions, and it's never as simple as multiplying something by 10 or 100. Like certain things break, certain things get easier, certain things get harder, and you have to sort of solve all that as you go.
And margin helps.
margins obviously help, but at some point you have to actually give your margins back to your shareholders, right? So you can't rely on that forever. And so as a startup, and this is something people told me for a long time, and I just did not believe them, and I was so stubborn. And now I can look back and say it's the most true thing I've ever heard, which is that as a startup, your only really precious resource, your constrained resource, the thing that you have to watch is management bandwidth and what you spend your time on, what you focus on. You cannot do everything, right? It's very tempting to, especially when something starts to work and you have people coming at you with all sorts of interesting ideas and speaking opportunities and deals they want to do and all sorts of things. And again, I heard people say this so many times, like how saying no a lot, all these things, and you're like, yeah. It's easy for you to say, like, you know, you want to drink from the fire hose when it's like when you actually get water, right? But like in hindsight, what we learned is like you got to choose wisely, and when you do something, you got to commit. And if you're wrong, you got to call it early and pull out, which fortunately we did with Berlin. But we learned a very important lesson.
But it's the opportunity cost, the time spent
the
learning that in
opportunity
Berlin.
cost, the like headaches, the like, you know, unhappy people, the whole thing. And so now when we go into a new market, especially an international market, we do tons of research. And we've built our own sort of like little sort of, you know, proto algorithm of like different scores of markets of like why would it work. And that's not really like, it doesn't like output the answer like yes or no, but it force ranks them. And then what we do is we sort of go through and we'll sort of say, okay, why would we go, I know we have this great opportunity in number 20, but it feels like we would be better off using our own money and going after number 8 before we do number 20. And that has worked a lot better. It's made us grow a little bit slower and be more careful, but I believe that having less mistakes leads to better growth over the long run. Like when we went through a phase where we were just like, hey, who wants to go open a market? Where do you want to go? Sounds good. Here's a little money. Have
General
fun.
Assembly, Rio de Janeiro,
Right.
here we come.
Mean, basically that's how GA Hong Kong got started. And it was great in the early days. It's exciting, it's fun. You have this appearance of a big footprint even when you're still a small startup. But then the chickens come home for roost, and like the sort of consequence of that period of sort of massive hypergrowth with zero discipline was that we almost ran out of money. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things that happens is you have all of a sudden 10 markets where you once had 2. The volatilities mean it's much harder to predict where everyone's going to come in on their cash usage. And things can accelerate out of control really, really fast. So we almost ran out of money. We almost went out of business. We didn't. But that was a big lesson, too, into growing wisely. So in terms of like a city and scaling up a city, it tends to be, that's where I'm all about the data, and I'm all about the metrics, and I'm all about the manager. And if we think the manager can do it, that's great. If the data says that they need more space, awesome. I always like to like push it a little past, comfortable. Mm-hmm. So, it's like we're doing this with our own headquarters space where, we're going to run out of space and we're going to need more headquarters space, but I don't want to take space until it's like cramped and nobody can get a conference room and they're complaining about it. And that's because the flip side of that, while that's a little uncomfortable and annoying, the flip side is taking more space than you need and then like just, flushing money down the tubes. And so that's sort of where I like to be always, is a little bit behind the curve, just a little, so that it's another margin of safety.
Great.